I learned early that in my family, discipline was mistaken for emptiness, and quiet was entered into evidence as failure. My name is Alexis Walsh, and the day my uncle called me a dropout in front of his boss was the day he discovered what I had actually been building in silence. By the time I turned 32, the accusation had become a tradition so rehearsed it no longer needed detail. They never said I had left school because my mother had collapsed in our kitchen and needed months of speech therapy, supervised medication, and someone to drive her to every appointment before dawn. They never said I had worked contracts at night and learned to sleep in 90-minute intervals because rent, insurance, and rehab bills did not care about academic timelines. They said what was simpler. They said I had drifted. They said I had no title. They said I had potential in the past tense. Families can turn selective memory into ceremony if enough people benefit from the same version of events. That afternoon, the Walsh barbecue had been arranged like a campaign stop. Uncle Brent hosted twice a year when he needed to be seen as both prosperous and personable. And this one mattered more than usual because he was entertaining regional executives from Halbrecht Systems. He had called me 3 days earlier with his voice in that polished register he used when he wanted labour without acknowledgement. "Your mother will be more comfortable if you come early," he had said. "We need another set of hands." He didn't ask whether I was free. He didn't ask whether I wanted to spend Saturday inside a social theatre where my role had already been assigned. He simply resumed where he had left off 20 years earlier. Brent at centre stage, everyone else as support function. The house sat on a low hill outside the city, all angular glass and expensive stone meant to look effortless. The backyard held 2 steel grills the size of small boats, a teak bar cart, and folded linen napkins weighted under crystal tumblers, while a warm wind moved through the maples. Someone had arranged donor-level bourbon in a neat amber gradient, as if we were curating a museum exhibit called Success in Liquid Form. At 2 in the afternoon, the first guests arrived wearing weekend casual that still carried boardroom geometry, pressed collars, muted watches, careful shoes that had never met mud. Brent greeted each one by surname and title. He introduced his procurement director, his golf partner, his trusted legal liaison. When I passed with a tray of iced water, he introduced me only once, to no one in particular, as my niece Alexis, helping out. I had expected that. What I had not expected was how quickly the old choreography returned in my own body. Shoulders steady, chin level, hands occupied, the discipline of practical invisibility. Keep moving and no one asks you to justify your life. Keep your expression neutral and no one gets the satisfaction of watching you recover. My mother sat under the shade sail near the herb planters, a light scarf tied over her hair though the air was warm. Her stroke had left a slight delay between thought and speech, and family gatherings exhausted her because people performed compassion too loudly around her and impatience too quietly around me. I brought her lemonade with extra ice and checked her pill case in my tote. She squeezed my wrist once, a gesture that still meant what words could not always carry for her. "I see you." That was enough to keep me there. By late afternoon, the guest list had thickened. Brent moved in practice diagonals between clusters of men discussing contracts, margins, and federal pacing. He laughed in short, declarative bursts, touched elbows, poured drinks he did not pay for, and narrated his own relevance in every circle. He had spent years turning confidence into a costume so convincing that people stopped asking where the fabric came from. In his version of family history, he was the one who held everyone together after my father left. In mine, he was the man who learned that control sounds respectable when spoken over grilled salmon and classical music. At one point, I stepped into the kitchen to refill a glass pitcher with cucumber water, and I caught my reflection in the dark window above the sink. Plain navy dress, hair tied back, no jewellery except a thin watch and a chain under my collar that no one ever asked about. I looked like staff in my own family's house. I looked like exactly what they had decided I was, competent at support, irrelevant at strategy. Something inside me tightened. Not from surprise, but from recognition. Pain is easier to carry when it is familiar. It also hardens if you carry it too long. Outside, Brent had assembled a semicircle near the bar cart. The air smelled of charcoal, rosemary, and expensive cologne. The metal lids on the grills reflected the lowering sun in flat white bands. I heard the clink of a spoon against crystal before I saw him raise his glass. Conversations thinned, and then stopped with that soft social obedience people mistake for courtesy. He smiled the way men smile when they are about to make sport of someone who cannot retaliate without being called emotional. "I want to introduce family," he said, drawing out the word just enough to suggest benevolence. A few guests turned toward me because I was standing nearest, pitcher in hand. "This is Alexis, our family cautionary tale. Left school, no title, no trajectory." There were laughs, light and brief, followed by that careful cruelty of polite smiles aimed slightly to the side of my face so no one had to claim direct responsibility. One woman took a measured sip and looked down at her shoes. A young manager I recognized from Halbrecht's Supplier Summit gave a small nod, as if the statement had clarified administrative confusion. Brent widened his smile, encouraged by silence. "Real professionals finish what they start," he added. The sentence landed exactly where he intended, in public air where denial becomes difficult and defense looks like confession. I stood still long enough to set the pitcher on the bar without sound. My pulse climbed, then flattened. No one moved to interrupt him. Not my cousin Dana near the planters, not Brent's wife with her fixed social grin, not the men who had just spent 20 minutes discussing ethics controls over bourbon, older than my career. No one defended me. Not him, not the guests, not the family members who claimed they hated conflict but attended every humiliation as if it were a holiday sport. I did not respond, not because I agreed with him and not because I lacked language. I stayed silent because public rooms run on hierarchy and timing, and I had already spent too much of my life proving myself to people who treated evidence as inconvenience. Silence wasn't peace. It was strategy. And strategy had kept my mother housed, medicated, and safe while Brent practiced leadership on patios. My mother called my name then, softly, the consonants a fraction delayed. I went to her, adjusted the blanket over her knees, and watched the gathering resume around us in staggered fragments. Someone changed the music. A server relit citronella candles along the stone wall. Brent pivoted toward a woman in a charcoal suit and began discussing delivery milestones with a confidence I recognized from risk reviews where men talk fastest when the numbers are weakest. I knew who she was before he said her name to someone else. Janice Orloff, Deputy General Counsel for Regional Operations, Halbrecht Systems. The same legal office that had sent me 2 encrypted requests in the prior quarter through intermediary channels Brent did not know existed. At 6:12, my phone buzzed once in my pocket, the custom vibration I reserved for priority signals. I glanced down while pretending to check a grocery reminder. The sender line showed a secured corporate address with an authentication key I had used before. Subject: Urgent Governance Session, HQ tonight. Attendance required. Named personnel only. Beneath that, a temporary access credential and a note from counsel. Bring Sentinel chain of custody materials if in possession. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Across the patio, Brent was still talking, one hand wrapped around his glass, one hand carving the air into neat slices of authority. He had no idea that his evening had already moved beyond this backyard performance. He had no idea the story he had told about me for years was about to meet a room where claims required documentation. He had no idea my name was already on the secure access list. When the sun dropped behind the trees and the first outdoor lights came on along the fence line, he finally crossed toward me with the expression of a man delivering instructions to domestic staff. "We have to head downtown," he said, lowering his voice as if confidentiality itself were proof of rank. "Legal issue, serious people only, stay here with your mother and help close up." I held his gaze for one measured second, then nodded as if I had accepted his terms. "Of course," I said. He turned away satisfied, already reaching for his car keys, never noticing that my tote was packed, my credentials were active, and the chain beneath my collar rested against the small titanium coin I had carried for years, engraved with the call sign he had never heard and the framework his company was about to beg me to defend. The coin lay flat against my sternum, cool through the fabric, while Brent resumed directing the patio as if he were chairing a board meeting instead of a family cookout. He moved quickly now, gathering his chosen circle with clipped hand motions, saying names and titles in the same breath, constructing urgency into status. Janice Orloff checked her watch and stepped aside to take a call, the lit edge of her phone reflecting against her cheek. Brent intercepted her as soon as she finished, nodding too often, speaking too loudly, and then he angled his body so half the yard could hear him. "We are moving to headquarters," he announced. "Critical governance matter, procurement, legal, delivery oversight. The core team." He glanced at me, then at the half-cleared buffet table behind me, as though both were part of one inventory line. "Alexis will stay here and handle close-out." A few guests gave me that brief managerial smile people use when assigning unpaid labour in public. One of Brent's directors, Martin Keel, lifted his bourbon and said, "Good, we need concentration tonight, not spectators." Brent laughed and added, "She prefers logistics, lower stakes." The sentence was mild on its face, almost polite. That was how he operated. He never struck directly when a lighter touch could produce the same obedience with better deniability. Around us, the yard had entered evening transition. The grill heat faded into a warm metallic smell, lawn lights clicked on one by one along the stone border, and the sky flattened into that early blue-grey that makes glass look like dark water. Under the shade sail, my mother watched the exchange with her hands folded over her napkin, eyes fixed on me with a steadiness that asked a question she did not have to speak. Janice looked from Brent to me, and for a brief second I thought she might intervene. Instead, she said, "We should leave in 10, and turned back toward the driveway. Brent took her silence as endorsement. "You heard counsel," he said to me. "Stay with your mother. We'll call if we need anything administrative." Anything administrative. After years of building the architecture they were about to put on trial, that was the role he offered in front of people who signed budgets with his name on them. A younger manager from risk operations, Ethan Vale, smoothed his cuff and said, "We'll need all credentialed leads in one room. No offence." "None taken," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I did not correct the record in his preferred arena, where men mistook volume for authority and familiarity for truth. I picked up a tray of empty glasses and carried it into the kitchen. Through the open sliders, I could still hear Brent giving departure instructions, assigning seats in vehicles, discussing parking access at Halbrecht headquarters as if the building itself might salute him when he arrived. Inside, the kitchen lighting was clinical and flat, bright enough to erase texture. I set each glass in the sink without clatter, then braced both palms on the counter until the pulse in my wrists slowed. Anger wanted speed. Strategy required sequence. I opened my tote, checked the encrypted USB in its shield sleeve, checked the printed chain of custody page I had notarized 2 months earlier, checked my temporary credential again. Active. Valid through 2359. Entry gate C and executive floor access pre-cleared. From the patio, Brent's voice carried through the glass. "Real pressure separates trained people from pretenders." There was polite laughter, then a pause, then Dana's softer tone, almost lost under the music. "Uncle Brent, maybe leave it." He answered her in the same cheerful register he used when dismissing objections. "I'm educating, not insulting." I closed the tote and exhaled once through my nose. That was the moment I realized he believed the script had already closed for the night. He thought he had set my role in front of his witnesses and sealed it with a joke. And because no one had challenged him, he assumed the room agreed. Families and corporations shared that weakness. Both could mistake unchallenged narratives for verified ones. By 7 o'clock, the driveway had become a choreography of headlights and key fobs. Guests collected jackets, exchanged cards, and shifted from leisure posture to executive posture with startling efficiency. I helped my mother to the powder room, waited outside the door, then settled her in the den with a small quilt she liked when evening chills came in from the hill. Dana came in behind us, pulling loose pins from her hair. "You don't have to stay if you have somewhere to be," she said quietly. "I can sit with her until Aunt Marlene returns." I studied her face. Dana had spent years surviving Brent by becoming useful in harmless ways, the family diplomat, the one who redirected conversations before they hardened into damage. Tonight, her eyes were tired and direct. No performance. "I may need to step out for work," I said. "Will you call me if she needs anything?" "Of course." She touched my mother's shoulder and smiled. "We've got this." My mother reached for my hand as I turned to leave. Her speech had improved enough that she could form short, clear lines when she concentrated. "Go," she said, each consonant deliberate. "Do your work." I bent and kissed her forehead. "I will." When I returned to the driveway, Brent was standing beside Janice's SUV, one hand on the open passenger door, still narrating his own indispensability. Martin Keel and Ethan Vale were within earshot, along with 2 audit specialists I recognized from federal reporting meetings. Brent saw my tote on my shoulder and frowned. "Where are you going?" "Downtown," I said. "I have a session." He gave a short, incredulous laugh. "No, you don't." Janice paused with one foot in the vehicle and turned toward us. The porch lights caught the edge of her glasses, making her expression unreadable. Brent continued, now performing for everyone clustered near the cars. "This is exactly the issue. Alexis hears high-stakes language and assumes inclusion. There are protocol layers she doesn't understand," Ethan added, eager to affiliate upward. "Secure floor requires sponsor authorization." I met his eyes. "Correct." Brent stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to imply civility while preserving the audience. "Do not make this difficult. Stay here. Handle cleanup. We are already exposed." The old pattern opened in front of me like a familiar corridor, him reducing, me either complying or fighting on terms he set, then later being blamed for tone, regardless of content. I felt the first rise of heat at the base of my throat and let it pass. Not because I was numb, but because I had learned what outrage cost in rooms designed to punish it. "I am not making anything difficult," I said. "I am following council instructions." He smiled without warmth. "Council did not contact you." Janice spoke then, crisp and neutral. "Brent, we are late." He did not move. "1 second." He turned back to me with that patient look adults use on children in front of company. "Alexis, please do not confuse prior clerical requests with governance authority. Tonight is not your lane." My fingers tightened once on the tote strap, then loosened. Silence wasn't peace. It was a refusal to bleed credibility in a driveway argument. I reached into my bag, removed my phone, and opened the secure message thread without handing it over. I angled the screen so Janice could read the header line and access token. Her gaze dropped, focused, and stayed there a fraction longer than courtesy required. She straightened. "Ms. Walsh is listed," she said. No one spoke for a beat. The night insects near the hedge seemed suddenly loud. Brent's jaw shifted. "Listed for what capacity?" Janice shut the SUV door instead of getting in. "That will be addressed in the room." Martin Keel cleared his throat and looked away toward the street. Ethan adjusted his cuff again, slower this time. Brent recovered quickly, as he always did when facts forced him to change tactics. "Fine," he said, voice flattening. "Ride with Dana later, we can't wait." "I drove," I said. He gave a stiff nod, meant to imply permission over something that was never his to grant. "Then do not speak unless asked. We cannot afford confusion." I held his gaze for a measured second. "Understood." It was not agreement, it was containment. The convoy rolled out in staggered order, taillights sliding down the hill road like red beads on wire. I waited until the last guest vehicle turned the corner, then walked to my car, set the tote on the passenger seat, and sat in darkness for 3 breaths before starting the engine. Through the front window, I could see the lit edge of the den where my mother rested, and Dana moved quietly past with a glass of water. That image steadied me more than any pep talk could have. My life had never been built in applause. It had been built in responsibilities met on time, records kept clean, and promises honoured when no one was watching. Downtown traffic was thin, the city's weekend gloss already settling over storefront glass and emptying office towers. At each light I rehearsed sequence rather than speech. Verify chain of custody, request wall feed control, establish timeline, isolate override signatures, propose containment activation, log dissent. Emotion could exist later. Procedure had to come first. 3 days earlier, I had rerun the dormant Sentinel pathway in a sandbox environment when a telemetry anomaly appeared in one of Halbrecht's subcontractor feeds. I had flagged exposure risk through encrypted council channels and attached mitigation parameters with conditional authority language. No reply had come then. Tonight was the reply. When I reached headquarters, the building rose in black panes and brushed steel, its lobby bright as an operating room behind revolving doors. Security at Gate C scanned my credential, checked my ID, and compared both to the emergency attendance roster on a tablet. The guard looked up, then down again, then handed my card back with both hands. "You're cleared, Ms. Walsh. Executive floor." Inside, the elevator bay smelled faintly of ozone and polished stone. Brent, Martin, Ethan, Janice, and 2 auditors were already waiting near the centre bank, their reflections doubled in the dark glass. Brent saw me approach and looked as if he had swallowed something bitter and refused to show it. No one offered greeting. No one offered apology. The hierarchy was still trying to repair itself around old assumptions, still testing whether I would accept the smaller outline they preferred. I stepped into the elevator when the doors opened, stood beside the control panel, and pressed the executive floor key. Brent started to speak, then stopped when the panel accepted my credential on first scan and lit the restricted indicator in quiet green. The doors closed on his unfinished sentence, and I kept my eyes on the stainless steel seam ahead of us while the car rose, choosing restraint one more time, not out of fear, but out of timing. The elevator climbed in a sealed hush, and every floor we passed felt like a layer of old family mythology, peeling away whether Brent consented or not. Stainless steel reflected us in narrow distortions, Janice upright and unreadable, Martin studying the floor numbers as if they might revise themselves, Ethan with his jaw set in the rigid confidence of a man who had learned policy language before he learned consequence, Brent standing half a pace ahead of everyone, as though position alone could still establish jurisdiction. I kept my tote against my hip and watched the restricted indicator glow above the door, steady green in a car full of people who had spent the evening deciding where I did not belong. When the doors opened, executive security met us before anyone moved. 2 officers in navy blazers checked names against tablets, then handed each of us temporary lanyards printed with incident session coding. Brent reached for his first. One of the officers angled the scanner toward me next. "Ms. Walsh," he said, "you are assigned presenter clearance, if requested, by counsel." Brent turned so quickly his badge clip struck the zipper on his jacket. "There is a mistake." The officer did not look at him. "No mistake, sir." Janice stepped forward and said, "We are already behind procedural clock. Move." We moved. The corridor outside the governance suite was all glass and subdued light, the kind designed to signal seriousness without admitting panic. On the interior wall, 3 muted screens displayed time-stamped telemetry with red markers flickering through supply chain nodes across 2 continents. At the far end, a conference room door stood open, and I could see legal binders stacked in strict columns at every seat, water carafes untouched, microphones live. Brent slowed near the threshold and lowered his voice, shaping concern into authority. "For the record, Alexis is family. She has no active role in procurement governance," I answered before Janice could. "For the record, I am present under legal summons." He gave me a patient smile meant for an audience that no longer existed. "Summons can include witnesses. Do not overread process." That sentence, with its polished diminishment, carried me backwards so fast I could almost smell the antiseptic of the rehab clinic where my mother relearned speech. Years earlier, when I withdrew from Westbridge Engineering after my 2nd semester, Brent had stood in our apartment kitchen with a sympathy expression he wore like borrowed clothing. My mother could not form full sentences then. She sat at the table tracing the edge of a paper cup while a home nurse reviewed dosage schedules. Brent looked at my withdrawal forms and said, "If she leaves now, she will never re-enter at competitive level." He said it as if I were absent. He said it to my mother, who could only nod or shake her head in delayed fragments. I said I would return when our finances stabilized. He smiled and told the nurse, "Alexis has always preferred easier routes." By the winter after my mother's stroke, that line had hardened into family doctrine. At Thanksgiving, he told cousins I had opted out of rigor. At Christmas, he announced, while carving ham under recessed lighting, that I was between plans. At my grandmother's memorial, he introduced me to 2 of her old church friends as our artistic one, because in his taxonomy, competence belonged only to people with visible titles and expensive cards. Each time I corrected him in private, he lifted one shoulder and said, I was sensitive. Each time I stayed quiet in public, the silence was entered as confirmation. In those same years, I worked contracts no one at the table understood. I passed vendor control frameworks at 2 in the morning while monitoring my mother's blood pressure every 4 hours. I took certification exams in proctored centres lit by fluorescent panels and left each one with another credential under an alias permitted by subcontract terms. I built models that predicted where compliance would fail before audits ever arrived. I wrote one protocol set so efficient at incident containment that 3 defense suppliers licensed it through an intermediary and never learned my face. Brent celebrated those companies at family dinners, praising their discipline and leadership culture, unaware he was admiring architecture drafted at my kitchen table between speech therapy homework and pharmacy refill calls. Ms. Walsh? Janice's voice brought me back. I was still standing at the conference room entrance with everyone waiting. I stepped inside and took the open seat at the side of counsel, not the back row Brent had clearly reserved for me in his head. He did not sit immediately. He remained standing until Martin pulled a chair for him near procurement, and the delay read less like strategy than disorientation. Outside counsel entered from a side door carrying a red-labelled incident file and 2 sealed evidence envelopes. Her nameplate read, Eliza Morrow, Special Governance Counsel. She placed the file at the centre of the polished walnut table and looked around once, counting presents against list. Recording begins at 1943, she said. This is an emergency governance session under Federal Contract Exposure Protocol. No one leaves without clearance. All statements are discoverable. She slid attendance sheets down both sides of the table. Sign with legal name and operational title. Pens clicked, pages moved. Brent signed in heavy strokes that pressed through 3 sheets. Martin signed Procurement Director. Ethan signed Risk Operations Manager. When the page reached me, there was a blank pause in the title field that seemed to unsettle people more than any argument could have. I wrote, Alexis Walsh, Independent Systems Architect, Sentinel Framework Author. Ethan glanced over, then let out a breath through his nose. That is not an internal title. Correct, I said. Brent leaned toward Eliza without lowering his voice. Counsel, this kind of self-designation is exactly why I raise concern. We need disciplined taxonomy. Eliza did not look up from the incident log. If you dispute a title, dispute it with documentation, not tone. A muted crackle came from the wall speakers as telemetry updated. One screen highlighted a transmission branch in amber, then red. Eliza opened the red file and distributed summary pages. At 1758, unauthorized policy override altered outbound inspection filters in procurement pipeline C17. At 1811, anomalous payload entered secured vendor lane. At 1816, federal partner issued provisional suspension notice pending containment proof. She paused long enough for the numbers to settle over the room. We have approximately 90 minutes before suspension escalates to formal non-compliance. Brent straightened and shifted into practiced crisis diction. Procurement acted under delivery pressure authorized at executive level. We can remediate through standard rollback. Eliza looked at him. Standard rollback failed at 1828. That is why we are here. For the first time that evening, Brent did not have an immediate second line. Eliza folded her hands. Before assignment of command, legal requested retrieval of any Sentinel chain of custody materials in private possession. Does anyone here hold such materials? No one moved. Martin looked confused. Ethan frowned at the word Sentinel as though it were a legacy program beneath his pay grade. Brent gave a quick dismissive shake of the head. I opened my tote. The room tracked the motion with that involuntary stillness people have when they sense a category shifting in real time. I removed a matte black shield sleeve first and set it beside the red file. Then I reached under my collar, drew out the chain and laid the titanium coin on the table where the overhead lights could catch the engraving. The coin was not decorative. One side carried a micro-etched serial ring, my call sign, and the original Sentinel authorization hash. The other carried a narrow inscription from the Incident Review Board that had commissioned the framework through an intermediary after a near failure at a coastal systems lab. Verified containment under live load. The edges were scored from years in my hand during night shifts, hospital waits, and audit calls taken from parking garages. I had carried it as a reminder that competence remained real even when no room acknowledged it. Ethan leaned forward. What is that supposed to prove? I kept my hand beside the coin. Not on it, that the protocol you licensed as third-party emergency architecture has traceable authorship, and I can validate every revision from version 1.2 to current dormant build. Brent gave a short laugh, thinner than before. A coin and a thumb drive are not legal proof. Eliza held out her palm. The drive? I passed it to her. She read the tamper seal number, compared it to a line in her packet, and nodded once. Seal matches pre-filed declaration. She looked at the coin next, then at me. May I? I slid it across. She rotated it under the desk lamp, reading the etching with careful precision. Her expression did not change, but her posture did. A slight recalibration from skepticism to procedural attention. "Where did you obtain this?" Brent asked, each word clipped. "From the board that commissioned Sentinel under intermediary contract after the Kestrel breach simulation," I said. "You were not in that review room." Martin blinked. "Kestrel was classified vendor testing. It was compartmentalized," I said, "not inaccessible." A silence settled, dense and technical rather than emotional. The screens continued to pulse red at the edge of the room. HVAC hummed overhead. Somewhere in the hallway, a phone rang twice and stopped. Brent reached for the coin as if to inspect it himself. Eliza moved it out of reach without comment and placed it beside the evidence envelopes. "Mr. Walsh," she said, "did you approve policy override 7C on pipeline C17 at 1741? He hesitated one fraction too long. "Under conditional throughput authority, yes." "Did you document legal concurrence before execution?" "We had verbal alignment in progress." "That is not an answer." Janice finally spoke, voice level and cold. "Legal concurrence was not granted." Brent's face lost colour in a slow drain that made him look abruptly older. "We were under severe delivery pressure." Eliza tapped the red file. "Pressure is not exemption." She turned to me. "Ms. Walsh, can you authenticate chain of custody for both items on record?" "I can." "Then do it now." I took the declaration form she passed, listed the USB serial, the encryption standard, the timestamp of original protocol compilation, and the custody timeline from intermediary transfer to private retention under legal instruction. Then I documented the coin. Issuance body, review date, serial ring, and inscription hash linkage to Sentinel Appendix B. My handwriting stayed steady because I had written versions of this statement in my head for years, waiting for a room that required truth in its complete form. When I finished, Eliza reviewed the page, signed witness certification, and pushed a second line toward Janice for countersignature. Janice signed without flourish. Ethan looked from the documents to me, recalculating aloud. "If this is valid, then dormant containment authority sits outside current org chart." "Temporarily," I said, "until governance records catch up with reality." Brent opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Counsel, even assuming technical contribution, command cannot be handed to someone with no internal leadership track." Eliza met his gaze. "Command is assigned by legal risk exposure and verified competence, not dinner party hierarchy." The sentence landed with quiet force, and no one moved for several beats. On the wall screen, the red branch intensified, then split. A countdown window appeared in the lower corner, marking time to federal escalation. Eliza pressed an intercom key. "Inform Executive Chair we have authenticated Sentinel authorship materials on site and require immediate directive." A reply came through static. "Executive Chair is en route from West Wing. ETA 3 minutes." 3 minutes was not long, but in that room it was enough for every prior assumption to show its seams. Brent stared at the dead pen in his hand as if it had betrayed him. Martin sat very still, eyes on the file he had not read carefully enough. Ethan stopped performing certainty and began taking notes. Janice folded her glasses, unfolded them, then looked directly at me for the first time that night with something like professional respect, not borrowed courtesy. I touched the place at my collarbone where the coin had rested for years and felt, not triumph, but alignment. The evidence was finally on record, the chain finally visible, the story no longer dependent on who spoke loudest at a family grill. The door at the end of the room opened and footsteps approached with the measured speed of someone accustomed to entering crises and deciding which voices counted. The footsteps stopped at the threshold, but it was not the executive chair. A senior aide in a grey suit stepped inside with a tablet and an apologetic expression sharpened by urgency. "Executive Chair is crossing from a call with Federal Counsel," he said. 2 minutes. He set a slim folder beside Eliza and withdrew without another word, leaving the door ajar behind him. 2 minutes became an opening. Brent recognized the way some men recognize weakness in a contract clause. He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and leaned into the silence as if he had been waiting all evening for a procedural foothold. "Counsel," he said, "before command assignment proceeds, I request formal clarification on standing." We are treating Ms. Walsh as operational authority based on artifacts she carried in as a private individual with no internal leadership designation. He said private individual as if it were a contamination vector. Eliza didn't answer immediately. She was reviewing the folder the aide had brought, eyes moving across lines I could not see. Brent took her silence as permission. This room is under federal exposure, he continued. We cannot run containment under unverifiable claims tied to family relationships. I move that she remain as an observer while qualified internal leads execute remediation. Martin nodded once, relieved to have a sentence he could stand inside. Ethan followed half a beat later, performing caution in the vocabulary of risk teams. For record integrity, I support restricted participation until credentials are independently confirmed through HR and contract registry. Janice's gaze stayed on the telemetry wall. She did not endorse them, but she did not interrupt. The slight was cleaner than the one at the barbecue. Better dressed, more expensive. Out there, he had called me a cautionary tale over bourbon and grilled salmon. In here, he called me an integrity risk in front of counsel and auditors. The instrument had changed. The intention had not. Eliza closed the folder and looked up. Motion noted. Not granted at this time. Brent held his ground. Then at least remove her from direct briefing position until the chair arrives. He reached for the attendance map near his binder, drew a short line through the seat code next to counsel, and circled one at the far wall where observers sat during non-voting sessions. He was still trying to move me physically, because control in rooms like this often began with furniture. I heard my own pulse in my ears, steady and hard. Old training surfaced, the kind no certificate names. Breathe low, speak only when it improves the record. Never let someone else define your scope by repetition. Eliza, I said, voice level. May I respond on standing with documentary sequence? Brent laughed once, brittle at the edges. This is not testimony hour. Eliza held up a hand without looking at him. You asked for clarification. You will hear it. She turned to me. 3 minutes. I opened my tote again and removed a thin folio of notarized pages in tamper sleeves, each one indexed by date and intermediary contract reference. I placed them beside the red file in chronological order, not dramatically, simply the way I had learned to place evidence so no one could claim confusion later. The first page was my independent contractor registry under Sentinel's intermediary vehicle. The second was a certification ledger from systems containment boards, recognized by 2 federal suppliers. The third was the sealed declaration Eliza had already countersigned tonight, linking the USB hash to protocol revisions. Standing does not originate from HR vanity titles, I said. It originates from chain of custody authority, verified authorship, and legal activation language. All 3 are here. Ethan leaned forward, scanning dates. These credentials are external. Correct, I said, because Sentinel was licensed externally and ingested internally. Your org chart did not generate that architecture, it inherited it. Martin looked at Brent, then at the pages again, as if hoping the dates might reorder themselves if he blinked long enough. Brent tried another lane. External credentials do not answer judgment concerns. She left a top engineering program and has no completed degree. We are discussing live federal exposure. There it was, the family folklore smuggled into governance process, humiliation translated into policy language. For a moment I could see my mother's old rehab room again. Fluorescent lights, dry erase board, syllable cards on a tray. Brent standing in the doorway with expensive sympathy and cheap conclusions. I kept my eyes on Eliza. I withdrew from Westbridge when my mother had a stroke and needed full-time care. I completed equivalent and advanced certification tracks over the following years while operating active containment contracts. The work product is what Halbrecht licensed. I slid one more page forward. Incident performance metrics from the Kestrel simulation, anonymized then, attributable now under release clause. Uptime restored. Escalation contained. No penalty assessed. No one spoke. The wall screen did the speaking for us, red branch pulsing against black map tiles, countdown running in the lower right corner with indifferent precision. By 1951, the timer had dropped below 70 minutes. Eliza tapped the table once. Any factual rebuttal with documentation? Brent's jaw flexed. This is procedural overreach. We are allowing personal narrative to displace command discipline. Janice turned from the screens at last. Command discipline was displaced at 1741, when Override 7C was executed without legal concurrence. The sentence hit him harder than volume could have. He shifted in his chair and reached for his pen, but his hand hovered above the page without touching down. He tried one final exclusion ritual, stripped to its core. Counsel, conflict of interest risk remains. She is my niece. Family dynamics are now in the room, I answered before Eliza could. Family dynamics entered the room when you used kinship to invalidate technical standing. Remove that variable and the record still holds. Eliza nodded once. Correct. Conflict noted. Neutralized by documentary basis. She looked towards security at the door. No seat changes. Miss Walsh remains in presenter position pending chair directive. The officer gave a short affirmative and stayed where he was. Brent sat back slowly as if the chair had shifted under him. Martin stopped making eye contact with anyone. Ethan gathered his papers into a perfect stack that no longer looked like confidence so much as self-protection. Across from me, one of the auditors marked something on her legal pad and underlined it twice. I felt the familiar ache behind my sternum, the afterimage of years spent being reduced in public while staying composed enough to survive the next bill, the next appointment, the next call at dawn. Something inside me did not crack this time. It aligned. Pain had been converted into procedure, and procedure was finally being heard. The door opened again. This time the room changed without anyone announcing it. Conversations ceased at intake of breath, chairs straightened, screens seemed suddenly brighter, though the lighting had not shifted at all. Margaret Halbrecht entered with the chief compliance officer beside her and no entourage beyond that, which told me she had come for decisions, not theatre. She wore a dark suit, cut for movement rather than display. Silver hair pinned back cleanly, reading glasses in one hand, tablet in the other. She did not sit immediately. She took in the room first, face unreadable, attention moving from the red file to the telemetry wall to the coin beside Eliza's hand. Status, she said. Eliza stood. Unauthorized override on pipeline C-17 triggered anomalous payload into secured vendor lane. Standard rollback failed. Federal partner issued provisional suspension. Sentinel authorship materials have been authenticated on site. Command assignment pending your directive. Margaret's eyes moved to Brent. Who approved 7C? Brent stood as well, voice formal and tight. I did. Under throughput pressure and anticipated legal alignment, we are prepared to remediate internally. Margaret did not nod. Anticipated legal alignment is not legal alignment. She turned to Janice. Janice answered in one line, no concurrence granted. Margaret looked at me then, direct and unhurried. Ms. Walsh? Just my name, no title, no qualifier, and somehow more respect than I had received in that building all night. Brent stepped in quickly, trying to frame the next sentence before she could ask the wrong person the right question. Madam Chair, with respect, Ms. Walsh is a family affiliate with disputed standing. We should rely on internal leads. Margaret lifted one hand and he stopped mid-breath. She crossed to the table, set down her tablet, and picked up the titanium coin between thumb and forefinger. Under the overhead light, the etched ring flashed once. Her gaze sharpened in a way I had seen only in people who remembered operational details years after everyone else filed them away. She rotated the coin and read the call sign aloud, quietly. Aster 9. The room went very still. She looked up at me. You carried this from Kestrel forward? Yes. You wrote Sentinel V 1.2 under intermediary veil and supervised live load validation after the coastal failure. Yes. It was not a question anymore. It was confirmation. Margaret set the coin down with deliberate care. I remember the after-action brief. Voice-only channel. You refused attribution and asked for the protocol to be licensed to smaller suppliers at cost so they could meet federal standards. Her mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like recognition settling into place. I asked then who Aster 9 was. Legal told me identity was sealed. Brent looked from her to me as if he had misheard the language itself. Margaret turned to Eliza. Is chain of custody clean? Clean and countersigned. Is authorship verified? Verified. Is current internal plan sufficient? Eliza answered without hesitation, not without sentinel activation under author command. Margaret faced the room, and her voice carried the calm force of someone accustomed to ending debates by defining reality. Ms. Walsh wrote the Sentinel framework. If she says this is the containment path, we follow it now. No one challenged her. No one even moved for several seconds. The hierarchy transferred in plain view, not by emotion, not by family loyalty, but by documented competence recognized at the only level Brent had ever cared about impressing. She looked back to me. Can you close the breach window before escalation? Yes, I said, if we execute in sequence and stop improvising throughput. Then brief. I stood and moved to the wall console. The security officer entered my presenter code. The screen accepted it on first scan. Behind me, chairs shifted as directors and managers turned toward the display. Pens ready, postures reset around a center they had spent hours pretending did not exist. Brent remained standing for a beat too long before sitting, face drained, hands still around a pen that no longer wrote anything useful. I called up the transmission map and placed my finger on the first red node. Containment starts here, I said, and for the first time in that room, no one tried to move me to the wall. Containment starts here, I said, and I expanded node C17 until the red branch filled the wall in layered lines of telemetry, authorization tags, and timestamp drift. The room had spent the last hour treating my presence as procedural noise. Now every eye followed my cursor as if it were the only instrument that still returned clean signal. At 17:41, override 7C removed inspection friction by design. At 17:58, the payload entered through the procurement lane masked as compressed audit traffic. Standard rollback failed because rollback trusted the same lane. We will not touch rollback again. I glanced once over my shoulder. Mr. Keel, isolate vendor lane C17 from automatic reconciliation. Manual hold only, Mr. Vale, suspend risk auto notifications to external dashboards for 12 minutes to prevent mirrored contamination. Janice, I need legal hold language issued now, not drafted now. Margaret gave a single nod, and the room moved. Chairs scraped, keys clicked. The first hold order went out within 30 seconds. The shift in hierarchy was not loud, it was exact. People who had called me unqualified 10 minutes earlier now waited for assignment before touching their screens. I mapped the transmission pathway line by line, tracing the payload's false checksum route through 3 internal relays Brent's team had flagged as efficiency optimized. Each relay carried his approval marker. I did not editorialize. I did not need to. Evidence spoken in sequence carries its own indictment. Relay 2 is where you hid latency, I said, magnifying the packet log. Relay 3 is where validation was downgraded from strict to adaptive to satisfy throughput targets. Brent leaned forward as though he could physically block the display by looking hard enough. That configuration was temporary. His voice had lost its patio polish. It came out dry, clipped. I kept my focus on the wall. Temporary choices generate permanent liability when they touch federal lanes. By 1958, the countdown window had dropped below 55 minutes, and the red markers began to stabilize at the edges where manual holds were live. I initiated dormant Sentinel subroutine access through the encrypted drive, entered the serial verification from the chain of custody page, and waited for the system to challenge. It did exactly as designed, asking for dual authentication, legal witness and framework author. Eliza stepped beside me and keyed her credential. I keyed mine. The panel flashed amber, then green. A low exhale moved through the room like wind slipping under a door. Sentinel containment shell is active, I said. Now we reroute inbound verification through independent checksum authority and force every suspect packet into quarantine. Ethan swallowed and asked, almost formal now, can we do that without triggering federal breach declaration? If we do it in this order, I said. If anyone improvises, we lose the window. Margaret remained standing behind the center seats, one hand on the back of a chair, reading each command as it propagated across the mirrored screens. She did not perform leadership. She practiced it in verbs. Record all command directives, she told the governance secretary at the side table. Timestamp every objection and every delay. Then to me, proceed. I did. Command 1, Freeze discretionary procurement overrides enterprise-wide. Command 2. Activate Sentinel filter set Gamma on C-Series lanes. Command 3. Initiate forensic copy before purge so legal retains evidentiary continuity. Martin looked up from his terminal, face washed in monitor light. Forensic copy will expose internal sign-off chain. That is the point, Janice said, not looking at him. Her tone was neither cruel nor sympathetic. It was simply finished with euphemism. The public reversal happened not in a speech, but in a sentence entered into minutes while everyone watched. Eliza read from the governance template, voice clear enough for the recording system and the people who had built careers on selective hearing. Emergency motion under exposure protocol. Temporary command authority for containment operations is reassigned to Ms. Alexis Walsh, Authenticated Sentinel Author, effective immediately through closure of current incident window. Margaret said, "Approved." The Chief Compliance Officer said, "Seconded." The Secretary repeated it for record confirmation, and the red light on the room microphone blinked steady as the line became institutional fact. Brent opened his mouth, closed it, then managed, "I object to scope." Eliza answered without turning. "Objection logged." Margaret added, "Overruled." That was all. No raised voices, no dramatic flourish, just the room's centre moving from him to me in language that carried legal force. I continued briefing while the motions circulated for signatures. Command 4. Lock policy overrides 7C and all derivatives pending review. Command 5. Redirect compliance attestations through independent channel. I looked at the audit specialists. "You two are now custodians for the copied logs, not procurement, not risk, audit." They nodded immediately. People obey faster when consequences have become visible. On the wall, the amber spread widened, and the deepest red node shrank to a pulsing border. 12 minutes later, the federal partner feed updated from provisional suspension to pending validation review. Still dangerous, but no longer cascading. "We hold this state for 9 minutes," I said. "Then submit containment proof packet alpha." Eliza checked the timer and said, "Do it." No one interrupted me again. That was the reversal in its purest form. The same room, the same people, the same fluorescent hum, but my instructions were now the structure everyone needed to stay employed. Brent sat very still, pen between his fingers, not writing. The dead pen had become a small, accidental emblem of the night. He tried to re-enter once, voice lower. "If we restore lane speed gradually, we may preserve delivery commitments." I answered without heat. "You are not in command." Margaret did not even look at him when she said, "Correct." The words landed with more weight than reprimand because they were administrative, not emotional. In institutions, that is how power is truly transferred. At 2017, I transmitted proof packet alpha with full chain of custody attachments, source logs, freeze orders, authentication hashes, and legal hold confirmation. The upload bar moved in slow measured increments while no one spoke. When it cleared, the federal portal returned acknowledgement with a verification queue tag. 43 seconds later, status changed to containment accepted, penalty hold deferred, pending formal review. The room released a collective breath that had been trapped since sunset. Martin sat back and removed his glasses with unsteady fingers. Ethan rubbed both palms on his trouser seams and stared at the screen as if expecting the red to return out of spite. It did not. The breach window was closed. "Record closure time 2018, Eliza said. "Incident downgraded from active escalation to controlled review." She turned pages, then addressed the table. "Next motion, immediate suspension of Mr. Brent Walsh from procurement oversight, pending internal investigation and external compliance audit." Brent looked up sharply, colour draining from his face in a visible sweep. "That is premature," Janice answered. "It is mandatory." Margaret said, "Approved." The Chief Compliance Officer seconded. The Secretary entered the vote. Brent's throat worked once before any sound came out. "You cannot remove me on a single event interpretation." Margaret finally met his eyes. "You approved an unauthorized override, misrepresented legal concurrence, and attempted to obstruct authenticated command during federal exposure." "This is not interpretation. This is record." The destabilization spread through his allies with clinical speed. Martin, who had mirrored Brent all evening, shifted his chair a few inches away as though distance could revise his timestamps. Ethan began typing what looked like retrospective caution notes, shoulders rigid, trying to build a paper trail to a safer future. Neither man defended Brent now. In crisis rooms, loyalty often lasts only as long as plausible deniability. Brent looked from one face to another and found procedural neutrality where he had expected backup. His hands stayed wrapped around the same pen, but they no longer moved. The cap had cracked under pressure, leaving a thin line of ink across his thumb he seemed not to notice. Margaret requested final verbal confirmations around the table. Counsel, containment valid, compliance, review track initiated, audit, evidence secured. Then she looked at me. Ms. Walsh, do you certify the Sentinel pathway has returned system integrity to acceptable threshold for this stage? I certify threshold recovery under current controls, I said. Sustained integrity depends on whether those controls remain intact after this meeting. Margaret inclined her head once, an acknowledgement between professionals. Noted for record. What happened next was quieter than the motions and somehow more devastating for Brent. Margaret asked the secretary to print the first page of the Sentinel protocol from the authenticated archive, the original framework header with the authorship notation now unsealed for internal record use. A printer hummed in the corner, spitting warm paper into the tray. She took the page, read the top line, then walked it to me in full sight of the table. For the corporate archive, she said, offering a pen that actually worked. Would you sign this, Ms. Walsh? For a moment I could hear the barbecue spoons striking crystal again, Brent's voice calling me a cautionary tale, the small, polite smiles. Then the present reasserted itself. Glass walls, legal binders, directors standing as they understood what they were witnessing. I signed my name in clean, steady strokes, Alexis Walsh. Margaret took the page back as if receiving a commissioned document and handed it to the secretary with both hands. Archive under governance, history, and incident doctrine. Around the table, several directors rose. One by one, they thanked me in concise, formal lines that sounded almost military in their precision. Thank you for decisive containment. Thank you for maintaining evidentiary continuity. Thank you for preserving contract standing. No one thanked Brent. He remained seated, face pale under the ceiling lights, watching the paper move away from him into the company record where he couldn't edit it. When the room began to break into post-incident channels, he stood and stepped toward me, voice lowered to something close to private. Alexis, we should speak outside. Clear misunderstandings before this goes further. I met his eyes and kept my tone even. There is no misunderstanding, there is documentation. Any further communication goes through compliance. He blinked once, as if the sentence had struck harder than volume could have. I added, keep all contact professional. Eliza, who had been gathering signed motions, looked up long enough to catch the exchange. That boundary will be noted, she said, and she wrote it down immediately. Brent's mouth tightened. He gave a short nod that carried no agreement, only recognition that the arena had changed and would not change back tonight. As people filed out to execute follow-up tasks, he stayed where he was for several seconds, alone at the end of the table with the broken pen in his hand, while the screens behind him displayed the stabilized network he had nearly broken and the protocol he had tried to silence now carrying his company through the consequences. The room thinned in careful layers after the vote, but procedure did not. Eliza called me back to the table while security closed the side doors and the governance secretary sorted the signed motions into colour-coded folders. The red incident file stayed at centre, open to the page where Brent's override timestamp sat beside Janice's non-concurrence note like two incompatible truths forced onto one line. Eliza set out evidence envelopes and spoke in the same measured tone she had used all night. We need disposition on all physical materials now, she said. USB, coin, and printed chain of custody originals. I nodded and sat. My hands were steady, though the adrenaline was beginning to drain from my wrists and shoulders in that delayed, heavy way that comes after sustained control. I watched her log the encrypted drive by serial, watched her initial the tamper strip, watched Janice countersign as legal witness. When she lifted the titanium coin, she paused. Do you want this retained in corporate evidence, or returned to personal custody with photographic certification? I looked at the engraving under fluorescent light, the call sign that had lived against my skin through hospital corridors, contract nights, and rooms that treated me as decorative labour. Photograph and certify, I said. Then return to personal custody. Eliza nodded. Appropriate, she called the evidence tech, who took high-resolution images of both sides, the micro-etching ring and the scored edge. I signed the form confirming temporary transfer and immediate return. The coin came back to my palm, warm from the tech's gloves. I threaded the chain through it again and tucked it beneath my collar, not as concealment this time, but as choice. Margaret re-entered while we were finishing signatures, carrying the archive copy of the Sentinel first page in a protective sleeve. Records accepted, she said to the secretary, then turned to me. The autograph request was not ceremonial. That page will be used in doctrine training. People should know whose framework kept this company inside federal eligibility tonight. I inclined my head once. Then they should also know what bypassed it. They will, she said. Brent was still in the room, standing near the wall with that same dead pen in his hand. He stepped forward as if he intended to speak, then stopped when Margaret's attention moved to him. Mr. Walsh, your access changes are already live, she said. Compliance will schedule your interview. Do not contact incident personnel except through counsel. His voice came out low and tight. Understood. He looked at me once, the old expectation still flickering behind the shock, as if private family pressure might still work where governance had not. I held his gaze without hostility and gave him nothing to negotiate. By midnight, I was in the legal records office on the 3rd floor, drafting the boundary email Eliza had advised me to send while the sequence was fresh. The office smelled like toner and chilled air, and the carpet muted every footstep to almost nothing. I addressed it to Brent, copied compliance, counsel, HR investigations, and executive chair staff. Subject line, communication protocol during active review. The body was concise. All future contact must be professional, written and routed through designated channels. No family intermediaries. No discussion of my mother's care arrangements without my written consent. I attached the meeting minute where my boundary had been entered on record and hit send at 0:14. The callback came 9 minutes later from compliance intake, not by phone, but by stamped acknowledgement in the case portal. Protocol accepted. Retaliation protections activated. Direct report restriction enforced. I saved the receipt to 3 locations and printed 1 hard copy for my files. Silence had protected me before. Documentation would protect me now. When I finally walked out, Janice was waiting near the elevator bank with her shoes in one hand and her jacket over her arm, looking less like corporate counsel and more like a woman who had been awake for 2 full days. She gave me a tired, direct look. In the driveway, she said. I recognized the token on your message thread. I should have shut Brent down sooner. You corrected the record when it counted, I said. She nodded, then added, For what it is worth, the legal office did receive your 2 encrypted warnings last quarter. They were forwarded, then deprioritized at operations level. That decision is now part of review. So that thread closed too. The messages had not vanished. They had been sidelined and now they were evidence. Janice pressed the elevator button and looked at me once more. If anyone implies tonight was luck, send them to me. The next morning, rain moved across the city in a fine grey sheet that made every window look like frosted glass. Dana met me at the house before 9, hair unpinned, coffee in both hands, still carrying the fatigue from yesterday, but none of the evasiveness. My mother sat at the kitchen table with her speech workbook open, pencil placed exactly parallel to the page margin, like she always did when she wanted to feel in control. Dana set a folder in front of me. Brent's office manager called at 7. He asked me to tell you he wants a family conversation before this gets ugly. I opened the folder instead of answering. Inside were the care invoices Brent had helped coordinate for 2 years through a preferred vendor with inflated rates and restrictive scheduling that always required his approval. I had suspected gatekeeping. Now I had numbers. Dana watched my face and said quietly, I pulled these from the shared file before they locked me out. Thank you, I said. Did he say anything else? She gave a short, humourless exhale. He said you were overreacting. My mother looked from Dana to me, then tapped the table once for attention. Her speech remained deliberate, but the words were clear. No more Brent control. No more, I said. At 10:30, we sat in a video meeting with Halbrecht's employee assistance director, a long-term care coordinator, and an independent social worker assigned through compliance remediation funds. It was not charity, it was part of corrective action after an exposure event tied to leadership misconduct. I reviewed options line by line: in-home therapy schedule, medication management, transport support, respite coverage, direct billing under my authority only. My mother listened, then pointed to the column that kept her in her own home with expanded weekday support. That one, she said. The coordinator smiled. We can start Monday. Start Monday, I repeated, and signed the intake documents while my mother watched each page turn. Brent's Gate was gone. The system that replaced it had names, numbers, and enforceable terms. 3 days passed before Margaret asked me to her office. The West Wing was quieter than the operations floors, all muted rugs and framed patents, but the conversation was plain. She slid a draft agreement across her desk. Strategic role, she said. Director of Systems Integrity, independent reporting line to Executive Chair and Compliance Committee. Compensation commensurate with market plus incident retainer. Full authority to halt procurement overrides that conflict with control architecture. I read every clause, including termination protections, whistleblower language, and budget discretion for audit tooling. I want one revision, I said. Any future deployment of Sentinel derivatives requires author review sign-off or designated successor trained by me. Margaret's mouth moved in that near smile again. Add it. I signed after legal amended the line in front of me. She countersigned and stood. Welcome, Director Walsh. The title did not heal the past. It did something better. It changed what could happen next. The final family gathering came the following Sunday in my mother's backyard, smaller than Brent's performances and cleaner in intent. No executives, no crystal theatre, no donor bourbon gradient, just folding chairs, grilled vegetables, iced tea, and relatives who had learned abruptly that old scripts had consequences. Brent arrived late without announcement, wearing the expression of a man testing whether the old room still existed. It did not. He approached while Dana was setting plates and my mother was practicing full sentences with her therapist under the maple tree. Alexis, he began, voice pitched for private repair. I made mistakes in tone. We are family. We should keep this internal. I set down the serving bowl and faced him squarely, calm enough to hear the birds over the fence and the sizzle from the grill. My name is Alexis Walsh, I said, each word even. I am Director of Systems Integrity at Halbrecht, reporting independently to Executive Chair and Compliance. Your review is ongoing. Communication stays on record. He swallowed, glanced toward the others and tried once more. I was trying to protect the company. Then start by telling the truth in your interview, I said. He had no line ready for that. After a moment he nodded, stepped back and moved to a chair at the edge of the yard where he stayed quiet for the rest of the afternoon. No one rescued him with narrative. No one asked me to soften mine. Later, as dusk settled and the first porch light clicked on, my mother reached for my hand the way she had at the barbecue, but her grip was firmer now. Proud, she said, without delay. I squeezed back. We're safe. That night, after dishes were done and the house had gone still, I stood alone at the kitchen sink and looked at my reflection in the dark window above it. Same face. Same scar of old fatigue at the eyes, same coin resting at my collarbone. What had changed was jurisdiction. Over my work, over my boundaries, over the story told in rooms where decisions are made. Silence was never weakness. It was deferred timing, disciplined and costly, and I no longer waited for permission to be seen.